Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my platform. Today, I have with me Parth Kalia. Parth is a US trained psychologist and is currently teaching at the Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts. Very warm welcome to you today, Parth.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always good when you touch base and have these really cool convos. I hope everything's going well. The pandemic, and here's hoping we're not going towards another lockdown. But yeah, lead us in. Let's tell our viewers what we're talking about today.
So, this week is World Suicide Prevention Day, which is on the 10th of September. And the theme for this year, which is for the second time in a row, the theme is working together to prevent suicides. So we're going to be talking more about suicide awareness and prevention, but more importantly, we're going to talk about the things that aren't really discussed. So because the facts are all out there. So I'm going to dive in with my first question part, and it is this. Um, so a lot of times we have clients who come in and tell us that they feel, and they've done enough research to tell you this, that they feel suicide or them attempting suicide is them euthanizing themselves of their pain and suffering. There is a distinction in when it comes to suicide and when it comes to euthanasia. And I was hoping that you could shed more light on that.
Absolutely. So, one very distinct way, and this is a colloquial definition, but when we speak about euthanasia, we are talking about the ending of life to prevent suffering, right? And that exact broad definition, someone attempting suicide towards that end might seem very parallel with that, right? Because their suffering, whether it is physical or in this case mental, does not have to be a huge distinction for them, right? But the one thing that distinguishes these things very often is the degree to which that mental pain, that agony, that anguish that is experienced by somebody who's, let's say, been very chronically depressed for a very long time. The distinction between that and, let's say, a chronic physical disorder or an ailment like that is that in many cases, perhaps not in all, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but in many, many cases, that psychological anguish is a few degrees more preventable than when we talk about euthanasia in its physical sense. Usually, when we talk about euthanasia, there's also the matter of terminal diagnoses where death is essentially also a guarantee. Factor. But looking at it at the heart of it, the core of it, the intent being you want to avoid pain, you want to avoid suffering, which is prolonged, which we know is going to be for the rest of our lives. The distinction there is that very often those that would draw parallels between attempted suicide and euthanasia is that their expectation is that pain will continue and it will not go away by any means. And very often that view is shaped by being depressed, by being by being in a very certain dark psychological place for a very long time, right? And one of the things about depression, or really a lot of mental illnesses, in fact, is that they sort of create cycles. They create the social deficits. They might withdraw from friends or family. But as we see, friends and family might be the supports that they need to feel better. So in depression, we also see signs like changes in sleep patterns and eating, which again, the first thing we might do to remedy that is to address those deficits. Say, what a good starting point would be physical fitness, sleep schedule, eating correctly. But this is precisely the thing that depression attacks, right? So in its own way, depression creates conditions that deepen itself, that this is how things are always going to be. And that's the big distinction there. That is the territory that therapists like you and I work in, is that it is not perhaps as permanent, as much of a given as we might think it to be. And that's where the big distinction is. Very often, through things like medication, through psychotherapy, even though the feeling better is not immediate, that euthanasia and attempted suicide are the same thing, and that they're both terminal, when in fact one is definitely terminal. The other one is perhaps less terminal than someone who's experiencing it might realize. I hope that kind of clarifies that a little bit. But the key differences here, and the one big word that I want to differentiate, even though it may not seem that way, is preventability, right? We talk about suicide as one of the most preventable causes of death. When it comes to life, loss of life in any kind of formation, it's car accidents, heart diseases, things like that. Well, mental health is much more preventable than some of those things. It's not let's say, bodily like some of those other things are. Isn't the pain and suffering involved not significant? It absolutely is. But these things are a little bit more, how do we say it, a little bit more permeable, a little more flexible than some of those physical conditions, and that's the territory that we work in to try and see improvement. Hope that answers that.
Right, Pat. So I apologize. In between, your video got stuck and so did your audio. So we kind of missed out on the part where you were talking about the role of the counselor. Where do we come in when we're trying to explain that distinction to them?
Excellent question. So essentially what we're talking about is instilling hope, and that's a four-letter word which is not done justice at all by those four letters. It's a huge thing to instill hope in a client. Very often, those who've dealt with this for a long time, it's characterized by hopelessness and helplessness. To instill hope is to essentially tell the person that, what, things can get better. And that's a difficult sell. It's a very hard sell to tell someone who's been in so much pain for so long that, hey, things can get better with the right steps, right? So how we go about doing that will depend on how we approach therapy and our individual styles. But very often, the thing that I've found helps is to show slight improvement, that even a small improvement can show a client that, they are absolutely capable of making the changes that they need. It can empower them to say, hey, what, I do have some ability to change my own state of mind. It can give that control back to them that they may feel that they've lost because of, let's say, chronic depression or really any other mental health disorder, any other mental illness. um, Again, the way I would personally do it, and this is very different for very different people, is that, I might try and find small changes, small variations that, well, let's say it was the worst day you've had. What was the second worst day you've had? When was it slightly better? Think back to a time when there was a slight improvement. And drawing attention to those differences can show someone that while it may always seem that, yeah, it's always at its worst, there are times when it is bad and there are times when it is worse. Therefore, there are times when it can be better, right? To turn those shades of gray, which are blurring together, make them a little bit more distinct, instead of making it sort of one line, you're breaking it down into very small points on the line. So you're going from decimal places to whole numbers almost, is a good sort of way to think about it, right? A person may not notice a distinction between I feel bad and I feel awful, but they might notice a difference between a 9.9 and a 9.8. So if you get them from that 9.9 to that 9.8, maybe that's the thing that starts them down the right path, down the path to seeking help or making the change that they might need to make for themselves. And I want to stress, really, we're not miracle workers, we're not magicians, we're not the ones doing the change. It's always our clients. We may just be gently nudging from behind, but the point of this is not to make changes for them, but to help them realize the changes that they can make for themselves. And that's a big part of it, is just empowerment also plays a big role in it. Positivity, and again, that sounds very cliche. I know there's a lot of what we call false positivity or even toxic positivity that goes around saying, everything is sunshine and rainbows. But less bad is what we're going for. We're not going for good. We're not going for great. We're not going for happy, on the first day or in the first week or in the first month. But we're trying to show them a vision where things could be slightly better. And then they could be slightly better after that. Small steps, small changes towards that long term goal. And again, keep in mind, different therapists might do this differently. That's one perspective on it. Mine is a little bit more, if you're getting technical, mine's perhaps a little bit more behavioral in that direction. I might give them specific things they can do. I would say for anybody, any layperson who's listening to this, general physical health plays a big role in it. Basic things like eating schedules, sleeping schedules being maintained, getting sunlight, getting exercise, getting some social contact, or doing activities, things that are self-care, as we say. Those are really helpful first steps. Just getting your physical health back a little bit will help you in that direction. And I will say that's true of most anybody, because our human biology mercifully is broadly the same. That's the one thing we all have in common, is we have the same sleep cycles, we have the same, blood mechanisms in our chest. So those changes, you can start to make. And
So when we're doing suicide awareness and prevention, right? We tell people that it's okay to ask the question, are you having thoughts of ending your life? Or do you have thoughts that you want to give up? Asking the question directly, right? Now that can feel uncomfortable, but I'd like you to elaborate a little more on why it's important. Why do we need to ask that direct question?
So that is a really, really good question. Um, Now, one thing, and we've talked about this before, and you'll probably see it in a lot of different places and a lot of different sources in literature, that asking the question directly and honestly is very important. The reason that, and again, many people also kind of know this, there's a certain level of awareness, even perhaps, that, maybe that's not the most accurate reason. Let's cut straight to the heart of the matter, which is that it's not really so much difficult for the person who's experiencing depression. It is difficult for the person asking the question to come to terms with the fact that this person in front of them may want to end their life. I mean, you're not going to ask that question to anybody and everybody that you come across. The reason you're asking that is because you have some reason to think that may be the case. So when we get to that, maybe the thing that really needs addressing is our own collective discomfort with asking that question, right? And again, it's a very understandable discomfort. There's a lot of psychological theories that talk about our death anxiety, and we all have death anxiety. We all fear death. We all fear talking about death, and of course we would. It's the end of life. It is, usually associated to events of immense grief in our lives, right? So death is always an uncomfortable topic, right? But here's the thing: your options at this point are to deal with the discomfort of death, or the prospect of someone, perhaps, god forbid, taking steps towards suicide because that question wasn't asked. And in that case, when you think about it as that choice, it's a very easy choice to make, right? When it comes to that, here are things you can do to kind of help with that concern, help with that fear. One is reminding yourself that, hey, okay, that's the equation here, that I can ask this uncomfortable question, or there's a risk involved, right? Other thing is that, it's, we all have that impulse, and it helps to address it head on and watch how we speak very carefully and directly. Instead of saying, do you want to end things, or do you want to do something stupid, it helps not to speak in innuendo, and it helps to ask directly. Do you want to hurt yourself? Do you want to kill yourself? Do you think life would be better if you were dead, right? So these are simple, direct ways to ask. And here's what we're doing, right, to dispel that particular myth directly. You're not going to give somebody ideas about suicide that has not already thought of these things themselves. In the same simple way that by listening to us talking about suicide, if you weren't already feeling suicidal, you're not likely to go out and attempt suicide solely by hearing this conversation, right? It's more than likely that the person who's experiencing this has already considered it, and this is merely giving them an option. It's giving them a very simple message that says, I am somebody you can speak to. I can speak openly about this. I can speak comfortably with you about this. It is creating a comfort zone for them where they can also talk about this really difficult thing for them with somebody else. And, sharing really helps, split the load, share the burdens of it. When you have somebody else that you can talk to, you have the opportunity to get out of your own head, as we say. It helps to get out of that headspace where the only inside voice that you have is your own. It helps you get another perspective. It helps to say it out loud because it makes things real, right? Not makes things real in the sense that, you're going to now attempt something because somebody asked you that question, but because it makes it clear that this is not something that I have to suffer in silence by myself. I have someone that I can share this load with, right? And that's the only message you're conveying when you ask. And you're not saying, hey, I know how you're feeling. You're not saying, hey, I care about you. You're demonstrating it. Rather than, telling, you are showing, hey, I can ask you this question without flinching when I say, do you want to kill yourself? I can say this without hiding my words, or, couching it in innuendo, or trying to make things more comfortable. It's already uncomfortable, right? For the person who's considering suicide, if you think the person's considering suicide, it's already uncomfortable for them. In fact, it's far worse than uncomfortable for them. For you, what happens next is going to be even more uncomfortable if you don't have that conversation. So that leaves us with a very simple direction to go in, which is to ask clearly, directly, unequivocally, right? Is this an intention that you have? Do you want to kill yourself? And, if the answer is yes, the next few questions also become kind of important, right? You want to find out things like, do they have plans in place? Have they tried something like this before? Have they made previous attempts, or have they written letters? Have they planned anything? And the closer they have come to it, that should give you an idea of intensity for them. Either which way, I would say at that point, get a professional involved, encourage the person to seek professional help, right? And while you can't drag somebody to therapy against their will, because ultimately, if you drag someone to therapy, it's not going to be perhaps as effective. I would say this is the one case where there's life and death involved that you probably should, right? And I would say that, that may not be the most popular opinion, but as therapists, Ashna, of course, and you will attest to this as well, that, in cases of suicide or self-harm, where there's someone's life at risk, even we put confidentiality on hold when it comes to that, because we know that the prevention of loss of life, right, is tantamount. That's the most important thing. So get them some professional help, get them to talk to somebody, and at the very least, reduce as many barriers as you can to them speaking openly about it and seeking help for it. And that's essentially all that's doing. You're reducing barriers, you're breaking down walls just by asking that simple question.
It also you know helps remove the shame that the individual is experiencing themselves, because there's tremendous taboo and shame around suicide, and you've got so many cultural opinions, religious opinions. I mean, there's all kinds of opinions around suicide, and the individual might be finding it difficult to express that they're having a difficulty because they're experiencing shame. So I think asking that question head on is kind of putting the shame out of the room. It's saying there's no shame here and we can talk about this. This brings me to my final question. In keeping with the theme for this year's World Suicide Prevention Day, which is working together to prevent suicide. Now, in 2017, the government made a huge change with the Mental Health Care Act, where they decriminalized attempt to suicide. Um, because it's a mental health issue, it's not a criminal issue, and they've recognized that. And the second very important thing that they did was they brought the onus public onto the public health sector to look after and care for people who've attempted suicide and work towards prevention. Now, whenever there is news of a celebrity suicide, um, people come out on social media and they'll put up these posts saying, I'm there for you and I'm here for you, which is great. But more importantly, what can we do proactively? And this is my question to you. What can we do proactively within our own individual spaces to raise awareness around suicide and prevent it?
Really good question. And, I think that whole theme of working together is one that really plays into this, right? I saw this interesting tweet that someone had shared at one point, where it said, it's very simple to reduce suicide prevention to, hey, reach out to people close to you. And if you see someone, ask them the questions and all of that. And that's absolutely right. Um, you should absolutely do all of those things. But what happens after that? The systems that, allowed this person's mental health, to be unseen, unobserved, and unheard in that whole time is still there, right? We still have a whole load of people out there who are still either dismissive or silent about this thing, about these issues, right? And where it becomes tough for us as advocates, where it can be tough for anybody who's advocating for these things, even those, and again, while it is well-meaning to post things on social media and raise awareness, absolutely keep doing that. It can't just stop there. That's not the end point of it. In fact, it isn't even just the end point to, if you see somebody in a difficult spot, asking them. It also comes down to a little bit of advocacy and a little bit of having some difficult conversations that everyone can do, which will make things a little bit better, right? Now, when we talked about that, the changing of legalities, that's a really big thing because it represents a very important kind of change, which is not personal, societal, it's systemic, right? So let me give you an example of what that can be like, right? So a systemic acknowledgement of mental health can look like, workplaces having EAP and mental health programs in place, or going to your supervisors and bosses in your companies and saying, hey, do we have a resident psychologist that, our staff can speak to if they need to? It's bringing in counselors in colleges and schools and making them more accessible, and not just having them as sort of token presences on campus, but also, once they are there, everyone who's in the company, all the students in the college, like making that collective effort to not judge, not stigmatize that at all, right? That's the part that's in our control. There's certain things that aren't. So, you know what, it's absolutely good when you put up a post saying, hey, I'm pro mental health, you can talk to me about this. That's great. also take the next step. Go ahead and say to your supervisor, or if you're, if you're a person who's an administrator in a college, in an organization, if you're part of leadership in any way, then this is something you can do, where you're a change maker. You can say, hey, you know what, we're going to talk about this. We're going to do maybe workplace seminars on this kind of thing. And again, cliche, I know, but a workplace seminar is a start. It's the tip of the iceberg, right? We're going to have an open conversation about this. We're going to have open conversations about how the work or our schools or our academics or our social circles are taxing or stressful to our mental health. And I think honestly, it's a very big conversation about even therapists talking to other therapists about how taxing our own work can be. For us, burnout is a very common thing for anyone in a helping profession, pardon me. We're talking, our healthcare workers who are really stressed because of this COVID pandemic and the pressures that they're under, making mental health care accessible to them as well. In our companies, in our schools, and a lot of the other frontline workers as well, police, military, things like that. These are all places where they may have, therapists there, but let's, for example, say the environment is that your superiors or your peers are going to be judgmental for you, seeking out those services. That's where the change can happen. That's where we all work together to destigmatize it. Decriminalizing mental health, that's a really big step, and we've taken that step. We're starting in the right direction there. Next step is destigmatizing, and it happens at a lot of different levels. By and large, we tend to talk about it at a personal level, that hey, in my social media or in my social circle, which is isolated from my workplace or which is isolated from my other circles, I'm going to talk about and advocate for mental health. It can go beyond that. You can bring it into a lot of your other social circles with you. And where it gets difficult is just the willingness to have that uncomfortable conversation, even when you know that it's perhaps not going to be heard out. Having this conversation at family dinner can be a difficult thing. And you may know that, there's going to be a little pushback, but it's still worth it to educate. It's worth it to spread awareness about that and have those conversations, not just for the people that you know are going to disagree with you, but also for those who are bystanders, who are listening to how you talk about mental health, who are listening to what you have to say, right? Very often we get into these debates, even on a debate show, for example, when you get into these debates, and we're going to get to the news and media side of it very briefly, but when you see these debates on the show, you're not going to convince someone necessarily from the other side about your perspective, but what you're there for is for the bystanders. So maybe someone who's listening to both sides of it and is hearing you talk about mental health can say, okay, you know what, there is something to this. There is something I can take away from this. There's some awareness or knowledge or some application to it, even in my personal life, that I can take away from this, right? Now, coming to the topic of media, obviously we've dealt with very public suicides in celebrities in our media sphere for a long time, right? And we've also dealt with it, admittedly, very poorly for a very long time, because speaking about suicide as a mental health crisis is not good for views. Speaking of it as, in terms of conspiracy theories, in terms of finger pointing, in terms of, blaming specific people is a lot easier, because it doesn't address, a broad audience discomfort with the topic of death. It doesn't address a broad audience discomfort with, hey, you might be part of a system that is maybe potentially problematic, right? And that's where we need to hold our media accountable. We need to choose our sources wisely. We need to empower, media outlets that are willing to take a responsible approach to this, patronize the right sources and say, you know what, these are the voices I'm going to amplify. This is how I'm going to advocate, not just in my circle, but also on a greater scale, where policy is involved, where news media is involved, right? Again, I understand it. It is uncomfortable to deal with the reality that we, in some ways, big and small, may contribute to the stigma that revolves around mental health, either by not talking about it or by speaking about it in ways that make things more difficult, right? But the answer to that cannot be to hold specific people accountable or to think about like suicide as some sort of isolated thing that only happens to certain people. It could happen to somebody that it could happen to somebody who's in your social media circle. It could happen to a coworker, a family member, a friend, a classmate, right? So the opinions that we express, the media voices that we choose to amplify and repost and share and blog about, those are all important, and we need to think very critically about that. And as viewers, as consumers, that's the bit where we get responsible and say, hey, you know what, I realize that this is not the most responsible way to report on things. In that case, let me patronize, let me share other media outlets that are doing a better job at it. And it's on us to identify that. So it's on us to go and educate ourselves about the details of it and the delicacies of it. And that we can do on our own time. I can't tell you everything, and we can't, if we were to do that, we'd be here all day. You could do a full week of podcasts on this and still wouldn't be enough. But start small, start simple. Suicide should not be sensationalized. The details, and particularly the gruesome details about it, are not necessary, right? The question also becomes, it should not all be about this incident, and it shouldn't all be about any one incident rather, or about pointing fingers. It should be about finding solutions and finding ways forward. Look for places that actually talk about ways forward, that talk about holding systems accountable, that talk about change, right? That try to not just point fingers but to provide solutions. And that's a really good way to start. Again, tip of the iceberg, but hopefully this helps.
Really insightful. Thank you so much, Parth. With this, we come to the end of this segment. I want to thank you for joining me once again and for taking the time out to talk to me about something so pertinent and so important.
It's good to be here again. I know we always have really good talks when we end up on these. Of course, like, I would love to do more of these. And yeah, I think if anything, just to take away from this, there's a lot of information out there, and we are, like I said, just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of good information to be found from a lot of different places, and there's a lot you can do to contribute to causes of mental health that go just beyond solidarity on social media. So whether it is a financial contribution, whether you want to go out and volunteer at a hotline, keep in mind that advocacy is a really big broad world, and there's a lot for you to do, and there's a huge need for it. Any help you can provide at any level, be it professionals such as you or me, be it administrators or people in positions of power, or be it just lay people who have the time to spare to go and work towards the cause of better mental health, all of it helps.